The cardiac monitor flatlined at 11:47 p.m., and instead of calling a code blue, the hospital director walked into the trauma room, looked at the unconscious man bleeding through his IV site, and told everyone to get out, not to help him, to leave. That was the moment Claire Donovan understood something was very, very wrong. She'd been at Redwood Regional Medical Center for 4 years, long enough to know every shortcut, every supply closet, every physician who padded charts, and everyone who didn't. Long enough to have memorized the rhythm of a cardiac emergency from 40 feet down the hallway. The sound coming out of that room wasn't a routine flatline. It was a man's body shutting down in a specific organized sequence that Claire had only read about once, in a military toxicology reference she'd stumbled across during a continuing education module 2 years ago. Nerve agent exposure, organophosphate class, muscular paralysis preceding respiratory failure. She stood outside the sealed trauma bay door with her hand pressed flat against the cool glass and watched Director Harlan Voss give quiet instructions to 2 men she had never seen before. They weren't wearing hospital badges. They weren't in scrubs. One of them was carrying a medical bag that looked wrong, too rigid, too structured, nothing like the soft nylon supply kits the hospital used. Donovan. She turned. Charge nurse Patrice Reyes was standing at her elbow with a tablet and an expression that said, "Don't. They want that room cleared of non-essential staff." "I'm the trauma nurse assigned to that patient." "You were." Voss reassigned. "To who? Those 2 aren't on our roster." Patrice dropped her voice. "Claire, walk away." She didn't walk away. The patient had come in 40 minutes earlier by ambulance, unconscious, no ID, no emergency contacts, no medical history that anyone could find. The paramedics had logged him as a John Doe and noted his clothing: unmarked black tactical pants, a compression shirt with no insignia, and a watch on his left wrist that the intake nurse had tried to remove and couldn't because it wasn't a watch. It had a small recessed button on the side casing and a display that showed numbers instead of time. Claire had noticed it when she was setting his IV line. She hadn't touched it. She wasn't sure why. Something about the way it sat against his skin, deliberate, permanent, made her leave it alone. His vitals on arrival had been abnormal but survivable. Pulse thready, pupils uneven, excessive secretions from nose and mouth that the paramedics had attributed to alcohol. But Claire had taken his initial vitals herself, and the picture didn't add up. His muscle tone was wrong. His jaw was rigid in a way that didn't match intoxication. And there was a smell, faint, chemical, just barely present under the standard hospital antiseptic, that she couldn't name but couldn't ignore. She'd flagged it to the attending on duty, Dr. Mercer, who had glanced at the chart, said alcohol and exposure, get him stable, and moved on. Then Voss had arrived. Directors didn't come down to the ER at midnight for John Doe's. That wasn't a thing that happened. Harlan Voss was a man who communicated through emails and assistant emails and the occasional passive-aggressive all-staff memo. He did not show up in trauma bays. Claire watched through the glass as the 2 unknown men moved around the patient with efficient, practiced motions. One checked the IV line. The other opened the rigid medical bag. She pushed the door open. "I need everyone out," Voss said without turning around. He had the kind of voice that had been polished by decades of board meetings. Controlled, flat, accustomed to not being questioned. "I'm the assigned trauma nurse for this patient." "You were reassigned." "I didn't receive that notification." Now he turned. Harlan Voss was 62, silver-haired, the kind of man whose authority had calcified into something that didn't flex anymore. He looked at Claire the way he looked at all the floor nurses, a brief, dismissive scan that ended somewhere around her badge. "Step aside or you're finished." The 2 men at the bedside had stopped moving. One of them was watching her with an expression that wasn't irritated or impatient. It was calculating. "I want to see his current tox panel," Claire said. "Something's off with his presentation." "His presentation is intoxication and exposure, Dr. Mercer already." Dr. Mercer spent 40 seconds with him. I spent 20 minutes. His fasciculation started about 15 minutes ago, and they're getting worse. That's not alcohol. Voss took a step toward her. "This is the last time I'm going to say it." She looked past him at the patient on the bed, at the IV line, at the bag the second man had opened. Inside it, she could see the tops of 3 syringes in a foam-lined case. They were preloaded, labeled, but the label typeface was wrong. Not the standard hospital pharmacy print, something printed elsewhere. "Get her out," Voss said. The man who'd been watching her moved around the bed, not rushing, the way someone moves when they're confident about the outcome. Claire stepped back through the door, sobbing. She didn't go to the break room. She didn't go to the nurse's station. She went to the supply alcove at the end of the east corridor, where the camera angle had a 6-foot blind spot she'd discovered by accident during a particularly bad shift 2 years ago. And she stood there for 90 seconds, thinking hard. The patient had fasciculations, involuntary muscle twitches, localized and progressive, excessive secretions, unequal pupils, rigid jaw, a faint chemical smell she couldn't place. Sludge. That was the mnemonic. Salivation, lacrimation, urination, defecation, gastrointestinal distress, emesis. The clinical presentation for organophosphate poisoning, for nerve agent exposure. She'd read about it in a FEMA preparedness document during a mandatory mass casualty training. She'd read about it, mentally filed it under things that happen in other places, and moved on. Except here it was. In Portland, Oregon. In the ER where she'd worked for 4 years. And the director had just sealed the room and brought in 2 men with preloaded syringes. Claire pulled out her personal phone, not her work phone, her personal one, and opened her notes app. She started typing. Arrival time, vitals, clinical presentation, the exact location of the IV insertion point, the label typeface on the syringes, the description of both men, the timestamp when Voss arrived, and the timestamp when the room was sealed. Then she stopped typing and looked at the watch on her wrist. She went back through her memory of the patient's intake, the device on his left wrist, the recessed button, the numerical display. She'd left it alone because it felt deliberate, but deliberate meant someone had put it there on purpose, which meant someone might be looking for him. The next 20 minutes were the strangest of Claire's professional life, and she'd once worked a 14-hour shift where a man came in with a live grenade in his jacket pocket. She needed to get back into that room without getting removed from the building. She needed to get close enough to that device to... She wasn't sure. Press the button? She had no idea what it did. It might do nothing. It might call someone. It might be a tracking device that was already broadcasting. She also needed to do something about the syringes, because the 2 men with the rigid medical bag were planning to inject something into a critically ill patient who could not protect himself, and Claire had exactly 0 official authority left in that trauma bay. She found an opening when the code team got called to the 2nd floor. A legitimate cardiac arrest, not staged. She could tell by the way the hallway shifted and the intercom crackled with the genuine controlled urgency of a real emergency. 3 nurses and a resident pulled away from the ER floor. The night shift supervisor went upstairs to manage the situation. Voss was on his phone in the hallway outside Trauma Bay 2, his back turned. The door wasn't locked. She went in. The patient was alone. Both men were gone. She could hear voices around the corner, low, clipped, probably dealing with something related to the shift change in the adjacent bay. She had maybe 2 minutes, possibly less. She checked his IV line first. The drip they'd set was running. Clear fluid, looked like saline, but the bag had a secondary port with a small inline reservoir she didn't recognize. She pulled on a glove, disconnected the secondary line, capped it, slid it into her scrub pocket. The patient's eyes were partially open. His chest was rising, but the intervals were wrong, too slow, too measured, the pattern of a respiratory system that was losing the argument. She leaned close to his ear. "I know you can hear me," she said quietly. "I'm a nurse. I think someone is trying to hurt you. I'm going to press the button on your watch." His eyes didn't move. His jaw twitched. She pressed the button. Nothing happened. No sound, no light, no vibration she could feel through the glove. She straightened up, checked the door, moved back to the IV setup, removed the preloaded syringe that had been clipped into the inline port. There was one, partially inserted, ready to push, and replaced it with a standard saline flush from the drawer beside the bed. Then she put the original syringe in her other pocket. "What are you doing?" It wasn't a question. The voice came from the doorway, one of the 2 men, the one who'd been watching her. Up close, he was younger than she'd thought, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of physical stillness that came from training rather than calm. "I'm checking the IV site," Claire said. "We had a reported infiltration. I'm the assigned..." "You were reassigned. I'm aware. I'm completing my handoff assessment. Hospital protocol requires..." "Get out." She walked toward the door. He didn't move entirely out of the way. She had to angle past him, and as she did, she felt the shape of what was under his jacket with a certainty that settled in her chest like a stone. He was carrying a weapon. She made it to the stairwell before her hands started shaking. She pressed her back against the painted cinder block wall and focused on breathing. 2 syringes in her pockets, 1 disconnected IV line, a patient who was actively dying, and an armed man who had just watched her walk out of a sealed trauma room. The shaking stopped. She'd learned a long time ago that fear was useful for about 30 seconds, and useless after that. She pulled out the syringe she'd taken from the inline port and looked at it under the stairwell fluorescent. The fluid inside was slightly viscous, not the visual consistency of standard medication. She couldn't test it here. She needed the lab. The hospital's toxicology lab was on the 3rd floor. At midnight, it ran a skeleton crew, usually 1 tech, sometimes 2. She could get there. She could requisition a stat analysis. She could... Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered it. Nurse Donovan. Male voice. Flat, professional, not aggressive. The kind of voice that was very used to delivering information under pressure. Don't hang up. We have eyes on the device. We know where he is. We need you to stall whatever's happening in that room for approximately 11 minutes. She stared at the stairwell wall. Who is this? Someone who's been trying to find him for 6 hours. You press the locator. That tells us you know something's wrong. There are armed men in that hospital room. A beat of silence. How many? 2 that I've seen, 1 carrying, and the director is running interference. The director of the hospital. Yes. Another silence, longer. 11 minutes, the voice said. Can you do that? I have his IV line and a preloaded syringe I pulled from the inline port. Whatever was in it, he didn't receive it. The sound on the other end changed. She couldn't describe it, just a subtle shift, like the air pressure changing in a room when a door opens somewhere else. Say that again. I switched out the syringe. He hasn't received whatever they loaded. Nurse Donovan. The voice was still controlled, but something underneath it had changed. Do not go back in that room. Do not approach those men. Find somewhere defensible and stay there until you hear rotors. Rotors, she repeated. 11 minutes. The line went dead. She went to the lab, not because it was the safest move, because she needed to know what was in the syringe. Milo Ferris was the overnight tox tech, 26 years old, eternally caffeinated, and deeply unbothered by unusual requests because he'd worked overnight at a hospital lab for 3 years and had developed a philosophical acceptance of the strange. Claire had once brought him a sample from a patient who'd ingested industrial cleaning solution at 2 in the morning, and he'd just reached for his gloves and said, "Give it here. I need a rapid analysis on this." She set the syringe on the intake counter in a sealed evidence bag she'd grabbed from the supply room on her way up. Whatever's in there, I need to know what class it is, specifically whether it's organophosphate derived. Milo looked at the bag, looked at her. You look like you've been running. I've been moving fast. Can you run it? I can run a spectro panel in about 8 minutes if nothing's backing up. He picked up the bag. Requisition? Patient name is John Doe, Trauma Bay 2 intake from tonight. Log it under my credentials. Your credentials are going to flag. You're not the assigned. Log it anyway. I'll deal with the flag. He looked at her for another second. Then he took the bag to the analyzer. She stood at the counter and watched the clock. 7 minutes had passed since she'd pressed the button on the patient's wrist device. She thought about the voice on the phone. 11 minutes. Find somewhere defensible. The professional calm that hadn't quite covered the urgency underneath. The way the sound on the line had changed when she'd said he hasn't received it. She thought about the patient's partial open eyes, his jaw twitching, the too slow, too measured rise of his chest. She thought about what Voss had looked like when she'd walked back into that room. Not angry, not startled, afraid. Not of her. Voss wasn't afraid of floor nurses, but of what she might have seen, what she might have taken, what she might have understood. Hey. Milo was back, and his expression had changed. The philosophical acceptance was still there, but under it now was something alert. This isn't a standard compound. What is it? I'd need more time for full characterization, but the spectro is flagging a cholinesterase inhibitor. High purity synthesis, not pharmaceutical grade. He paused. Claire, this isn't something we see in this lab. Military? He put his hands flat on the counter. I'm saying I've never seen this formulation in 4 years of running tox panels. And the concentration? He stopped. Tell me. At this concentration, administered intravenously to someone already exhibiting the symptoms you described, it would probably present as natural cardiac failure within about 15 minutes of injection. He looked at the syringe bag. This wasn't treatment. The clock on the wall, 12:08 a.m. 11 minutes had elapsed. She became aware of the sound at the same time Milo did. They both looked up because it was coming from outside the building, from above, and it was getting louder, and there was nothing about it that resembled any sound the hospital normally made. Rotors. Not one. Multiple. The overhead fluorescents flickered once. Through the lab's exterior window, the parking structure across the street lit up in a moving wash of white, searchlights sweeping down from above, the downwash from the rotors pressing the surface water on the parking deck into radiating ripples. Milo said very quietly, "What is happening?" Claire was already moving toward the door. She heard the impact on the roof before she reached the stairwell. A controlled thud, multiple points simultaneously, the sound of men landing in organized sequence. And then the building's intercom crackled twice and went silent, and somewhere below her in the emergency department, someone shouted in a voice that was trying to stay professional and failing. And then there were running footsteps, and then a sound she recognized from every military action film she'd ever watched and had hoped she would never hear in real life. The distinctive mechanical sound of rifles being readied. She pushed through the stairwell door. Below her, she could hear it spreading floor by floor, the sharp, organized intrusion of people who moved with absolute purpose. Commands, short and clipped. Doors. And then a voice, different from the others, older, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being the final word in a room, cutting through the noise with 3 words that reached her clearly, even through 2 floors and a stairwell door. Find the nurse. Claire Donovan stood on the second-floor landing with 2 compromised syringes in her pocket, her hands steady now, her heart rate somewhere between controlled and not, and listened to the sound of Black Hawk helicopters settling onto the roof of Redwood Regional Medical Center. She had 11 minutes ago pressed a button. She didn't understand on the wrist of a man she didn't know. Whatever she'd started, it was no longer something that could be undone. She took a breath, straightened her badge, and started walking down the stairs toward whatever was waiting at the bottom. She heard them before she saw them. 2 operators in full tactical gear were coming up the stairwell from below, moving fast but controlled, rifles angled down rather than raised. A distinction she recognized as the difference between searching and hunting. She kept her hands visible and kept walking, because stopping in a stairwell, when armed men were moving toward you, was exactly the kind of thing that went wrong. "Donovan," the lead operator said. Not a question. "Yes." "Come with us." She fell into step behind them without argument. This was not the moment for questions. The stairwell door opened onto the ground floor and the emergency department, and what she walked into bore almost no resemblance to the ER she'd worked 4 hours ago. 6 operators occupied the hallway. 2 had secured the corridor leading to Trauma Bay 2. One was managing a cluster of hospital staff who had been moved to the far end of the nurses' station. Orderlies, 2 night shift nurses, a confused resident who looked like he'd been pulled out of a supply closet. The overhead lights were all on, which wasn't normal for midnight. Someone had overridden the automatic dimming. Every security camera mount she could see had a small device clipped to it, purpose unknown. Director Voss was standing against the wall near the admitting desk with his hands at his sides and his jacket slightly rumpled, which was the most disordered she had ever seen him look. Standing next to him, with one hand resting on a rifle that was slung across his chest rather than raised, was a man she hadn't seen come in. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, broad through the shoulders, wearing tactical dress without insignia. The kind of face that had been outdoors in difficult conditions for most of its life. He turned when she came through the door and looked at her with the particular attention of someone cross-referencing a mental photograph. "Nurse Donovan," same voice from the phone. "Commander Garrett Sloan, JSOC." She didn't know what JSOC stood for, and this wasn't the time to ask. "He's in Trauma Bay 2. His respiratory pattern was deteriorating when I left. That was," she checked the clock on the wall, "about 9 minutes ago." "We have a medic with him. What did you pull from the inline port?" She reached into her scrub pocket and produced the capped secondary line and the syringe in its evidence bag. Sloan took both and passed them immediately to a second man without looking at them. "The Tox Tech on the third floor has a spectro panel running," she said. "He'd already flagged it as a cholinesterase inhibitor at high concentration before I came down. Not pharmaceutical synthesis." His words. Sloan held her gaze for a moment. "You sent a civilian lab tech to analyze a military-grade compound. I needed to know what was in the syringe. He was going to receive it." Something in Sloan's expression shifted, not exactly softened, more like adjusted. "Walk me through his presentation from intake." She did. All of it. The sludge indicators, the fasciculations, the uneven pupils, the chemical smell, the wrong muscle tone. Sloan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at the operator to his left and said, "Get Rourke out here." The medic who came out of Trauma Bay 2 was in his 30s, compact, with blood on his left glove that he hadn't had time to change. He pulled his mask down when he saw Sloan and said, "He's not stabilized, but he's not losing anymore. Whoever pulled that secondary line—" He stopped, looked at Claire. "Was that you?" "Yes." "When?" "About 12 minutes before you arrived." He exhaled through his nose. "Okay, that matters. The nerve agent load in his system is significant but incomplete. If that secondary dose had gone in on top of what he'd already received," he trailed off. "He's got a fighting chance. Not a guarantee, but a chance." Claire had been a trauma nurse long enough to know what fighting chance really meant when a medic said it with that particular tension in his jaw. It meant the next 2 hours were going to be the whole story. "I need to be in there," she said. Rourke glanced at Sloan. She knows his presentation from onset," Sloan said, "better than anyone in this building. She's not military medical. She pulled the line 12 minutes before we got here. We work with what we have." Rourke looked at Claire for a long moment, the evaluative look of someone deciding whether a tool was worth picking up. "You comfortable with atropine and pralidoxime protocol?" "I've never used it in the field, but I know the mechanism. Walk me through your dosing and I'll keep up." He turned and went back into the room. She followed. The patient, she still didn't know his name, was worse than when she'd left, but not by as much as she'd feared. The fasciculations had spread from his jaw and hands to his torso. His color was poor, but he was breathing on his own, which Rourke confirmed was meaningful. "Pralidoxime first. We're trying to reactivate the cholinesterase before the inhibitor bonds permanently. Atropine to manage the secretions and the bradycardia." Rourke was already moving. "IV access?" "Right antecubital, 16 gauge. I set it on intake. Still patent." She checked the site. "Yes." "Push the prali first, slow, over 15 to 20 minutes, not faster." She drew the dose and started the push, watching the drip rate, watching the monitor beside the bed. The patient's heart rate was 44, which was too slow but not immediately fatal. Rourke worked on the opposite side, adjusting the fluid rate, attaching a second monitor lead. "He have a name?" she asked. "Captain Marcus Veld." Rourke didn't look up from the monitor. "Special Warfare Development Group. He's been under for the last 6 months on a domestic interdiction operation." She didn't ask what that meant. She focused on the drip rate. "The people who brought him in," she said. "The armed men. Where are they?" "Secured." "Voss?" "In the hallway." The patient, Captain Veld, made a sound then. Not a word, not coherent, but volitional. His hand moved. Not a fasciculation, a deliberate movement, fingers curling and releasing. "He's in there," Rourke said quietly. There was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. "Marcus, can you hear me?" The hand moved again. "We've got you. Don't try to talk." Claire kept her eyes on the drip. She counted the seconds. In her peripheral vision, she could see the trace on the cardiac monitor, beginning, very slowly, to normalize. Still abnormal, but trending in the right direction. 12 minutes of not receiving that secondary dose, she thought. That's what 12 minutes bought. Sloan came into the room 20 minutes later, which was how Claire knew things outside had progressed to a stage where he could leave them alone. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at the monitor, and something in his posture told her he'd seen men in medical situations before and learned to read the equipment. "Lab results came down," he said. "Your tech flagged it accurately. GX7 derivative, modified synthesis, higher binding rate than standard formulation." He paused. We've been tracking a supply chain for this compound for 8 months, and it was in a hospital in Portland. The hospital was a transit point. We think it's been used as a staging location for at least 18 months. He looked at her. Your director had a financial relationship with the people we've been tracking, narcotics diversion, evidence disposal, and apparently wet work when the operation needed coverage. She absorbed that. Wet work. She'd heard the term before in a vague context. It landed differently now. The 2 men in the room, she said, private contractors, not military. They'll be processed by federal custody tonight. He paused. The fake physician, the man who arrived 40 minutes before we did, carrying the bag. Do you know where he went? She looked up. I only saw the 2. There was no physician. Our entry team found a physician's badge and a prescription pad in the bathroom adjacent to Bay 2. White male, 40 to 50, heavy build, no surveillance capture because the cameras in that corridor had been disabled. She thought about the layout. The bathroom beside Bay 2 had a secondary exit into the back service corridor. She'd used it to shortcut to the supply room before, years ago. Not many people would know that. He knew the building, she said, or someone told him. She looked at the patient on the bed. Rourke was adjusting the atropine dose, making small, methodical corrections. Captain Veld's color was incrementally better. Still gray, still wrong, but not the waxy, draining color of irreversible shutdown. How long has he been under? She asked. 6 months embedded in the network we've been targeting. When his cover was compromised 3 days ago, we lost contact. Tonight was the first signal we've had. Sloane's voice stayed level, but something behind his eyes wasn't. He's been on his own for 72 hours. She thought about what 72 hours alone inside a compromised cover operation meant for a human being, and then she stopped thinking about it because there was nothing useful she could do with that information right now. It was Patrice Reyes who found her at 1:30 in the morning. Patrice had been part of the staff cluster at the nurses' station, and someone had eventually allowed the non-essential personnel to relocate to the break room under escort. But Patrice was the charge nurse, and charge nurses had a particular relationship with staying places they'd been told not to stay. She appeared in the doorway of Trauma Bay 2, looked at the room full of military personnel, looked at Claire standing at the IV pump, and said, "What did you do?" "Not now, Patrice. Claire, he's stable enough that I can come out in about 10 minutes. Wait for me." Patrice left. But she waited. When Claire came out, she found Patrice in the corridor with her arms crossed, and the expression of someone who had rehearsed a lecture and then thought better of it. "Voss is claiming you stole medication from a patient," Patrice said quietly. "He's been on the phone with hospital legal since they let him have his phone back. I removed a syringe loaded with military-grade nerve agent from a patient's IV line before it could be administered." Patrice stared at her. "The tox results are on the 3rd floor with Milo Ferris's name on the requisition. The syringe is with the federal team." Claire kept her voice level. "Voss can call whoever he wants. He's saying you're going to be terminated. Suspended pending review, then terminated. He's going to be in federal custody before sunrise." Patrice opened her mouth, closed it, looked down the corridor at the 2 operators who were still holding the perimeter by the exit, looked back at Claire. "You knew," Patrice said. "When I told you to walk away, you already knew something was wrong." "I suspected." "That's not nothing, Claire. That's—" She stopped, started again. "You should have told me. If I told you, you'd have been in that room with me. And then there would have been 2 of us for that man to deal with instead of 1. She looked at Patrice steadily. This was better. It wasn't a kind thing to say, and it wasn't meant to be. It was the truth. Patrice was quiet for a long moment. Is he going to make it? Probably, if the next 2 hours go the way the last 30 minutes went. She rubbed the back of her neck. Probably is the best I can give you right now. Well, the shift in the building happened somewhere around 2 in the morning. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of shift that happened when the acute phase of something ended and the investigative phase began. When the people with rifles were replaced by people with cameras and evidence bags. When the shouted commands gave way to quiet professional conversation. 2 agents from federal law enforcement arrived and spent 45 minutes with Sloane before fanning out through the building. Voss had been moved to a secured administrative office. Claire passed the hallway on her way back from the lab and could hear his voice through the closed door, still controlled, still board meeting flat, but with a quality underneath that she recognized as someone managing active panic. She thought about the moment he'd looked at her and said, "You're finished." the particular confidence of a man who had never been wrong about his own authority before. She thought about it without satisfaction. There wasn't room for satisfaction yet. Veld was still in the bay, still not stable enough that anyone could relax. Rourke found her near the nurse's station at 2:15. He'd changed his gloves and there was less tension in his shoulders, which meant things in the room were holding. His acetylcholinesterase activity is recovering, Rourke said. Slowly, but it's moving the right direction. Respiratory? Still assisted, but he's breathing over the vent, which is a good sign. He paused. You did the right thing with the syringe. I want to say that clearly. A lot of people would have backed down. I almost did, she said. He looked at her. When Voss told me to step aside, for about 3 seconds, I almost did. She said it because it was true and because she didn't think she deserved a cleaner version of events than what had actually happened. Then I looked at the bag, and I didn't. Rourke was quiet for a moment. 3 seconds is nothing. 3 seconds happens to everyone. I know, I'm just saying. He nodded once, the nod of someone who understood that kind of honesty, and left to go back to his patient. It was Sloan who told her about the termination notice at 2:40. He found her at the nurse's station, where she was documenting. She was still technically on shift, technically still a nurse in this hospital, until someone handed her a piece of paper, and documentation was what nurses did. Voss submitted a formal termination notice through the hospital's HR system at 2:32, Sloan said. He set a printout on the counter beside her. Your access badge has been flagged for deactivation. She looked at the printout. Her name, her employee ID, terminated for cause, theft of medical supplies, unauthorized access to restricted patient care area, insubordination. She set it back down. Does he have authority to do that right now? Technically, yes. His position hasn't been formally suspended yet. Sloan's tone was matter-of-fact, not apologetic. That will change. But it hasn't changed yet. She looked at the document and then at the door of Trauma Bay 2 down the hall, where a man was alive right now because of a chain of decisions she'd made over the last 3 hours. Okay, she said. Okay, Sloan repeated. I mean, what else is there to say right now? Marcus Veld is in that room and he's got a chance. The rest of this is paperwork. She picked up her pen. I'm going to finish documenting this patient encounter and then I'll deal with whatever I have to deal with. Sloan looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. We're going to need your full statement. Everything from intake to present. Every detail. I know. I'll give it. And the documentation you put on your personal phone, the timestamps, the descriptions. You'll have all of it. He started to turn away. She stopped him. The man who left through the service corridor, she said. The one with the physician's badge. Have you found him? Sloan's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. Not yet. She held the pen without moving. He knew the building's layout, the secondary exit from the bathroom. That's not something you learn from a floor plan. We're aware. Which means whoever briefed him had been inside this building before. Maybe more than once. She looked at the termination notice still lying on the counter. Voss has been director here for 6 years. He knows everyone who comes in and out. Sloan held her gaze. We're going to want that statement as soon as possible, Nurse Donovan. I'm not going anywhere. It wasn't until he walked away that she realized she'd used the word nurse in a building where she had just been formally terminated. She picked up her pen and kept writing. The quiet that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the charged, pressurized quiet of a situation that had stopped moving but hadn't stopped building. Federal agents were cataloging the contents of the medical bag from the rigid case. The preloaded syringes, all 3 of them, the 2 she hadn't touched, were being handled with the particular caution of people who knew exactly what they were dealing with. Milo Ferris had come down from the lab voluntarily at some point and was now talking to 2 agents with the focused energy of someone who had decided tonight was the most professionally significant night of his life. Patrice had stopped trying to manage the rest of the night shift staff and had simply started doing the work herself, redirecting incoming patients to the secondary entrance, keeping the occupied bays running, covering the gaps left by the operators still on the floor. Claire watched her for a moment and felt something that wasn't quite gratitude but was close to it. She was on her second page of documentation when her badge reader beeped and went dark. Access revoked. Right there at the nurse's station, while she was sitting at the nurse's station, in the middle of the shift she'd worked for 11 of the last 12 hours. She looked at the dark badge reader. She kept writing. On paper. At 3:15 in the morning, one of the federal agents came to find her with a recording device and a legal pad. She gave him 2 hours of detailed sequential statement, intake presentation, clinical observations, the syringe, the device on Veld's wrist, the phone call, the lab, the return to the ER, all of it. Dates, times, physical descriptions. She didn't editorialize and she didn't minimize. She gave it the way she'd been trained to give a nursing report, accurate, sequenced, complete. When it was done, she sat in the chair by the nursing station and felt the shift in her body that came at the end of something long and dangerous. Not relief. It wasn't over enough for relief. More like the moment when your hands finally stop shaking, not because the fear is gone, but because the body has decided it's run out of adrenaline and is billing you for the rest later. Rourke appeared at 4:40 and said, "His pressure came up 40 minutes ago. It's been holding." She nodded. "He's going to make it," Rourke said. "I can say that now." She nodded again, didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wasn't either too small or too large. Outside the hospital windows, the sky over Portland was starting to change. Not yet light, but the specific heavy dark that preceded it. The Blackhawks were gone. She'd heard them lift off sometime around 3 without really registering it. The way you stop hearing something your nervous system has processed into background. She stood up, stretched her back, and went to the locker room to get her things. Her badge was dead. Her access was revoked. Her employment was, on paper, terminated. She changed out of her scrubs, put her jacket on, and came back out through the main nursing corridor one last time. Sloan was in the hallway. He looked at the jacket, looked at her bag. "We'll be in contact today," he said. "Don't travel." "I live 12 minutes from here. I'm not going anywhere." She walked toward the exit. The early morning air hit her when the automatic doors slid back, cold, damp, carrying the specific smell of a Pacific Northwest pre-dawn. She stopped on the sidewalk and stood there for a moment. Behind her, through the glass, she could see the glow of the ER, the movement of people inside, the quiet, purposeful aftermath of something that had not gone the way it was supposed to go. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. But not the same unknown number as before. Different prefix. She answered. The voice on the other end was female, clipped, professional, in the way that Sloan had been professional, but with a different register. Administrative authority rather than tactical. "Nurse Donovan, my name is Deputy Director Hannah Merritt. I'm with the federal task force that has jurisdiction over the operation that was executed tonight at your facility." A pause. "We need you to come in. Now. Not this morning. Now." Claire looked at the dark parking lot, at her car 3 rows in. "Why?" "Because the man who left through that service corridor tonight has been identified. And what we found on him changes the scope of this investigation significantly." She waited. "He didn't just know the building layout, Nurse Donovan. He had your personnel file on him, your photo, your home address." The cold air pressed against the back of her neck. "How long ago was he identified?" 20 minutes? She was already walking toward her car. "Send me the address." The address came through as a pin dropped to a federal building 17 minutes from the hospital. A nondescript 4-story structure near the waterfront that Claire had driven past 100 times without registering it as anything other than a government office of some undetermined variety. She drove with both hands on the wheel and the heater on because her hands were cold, not because she was cold, which was a distinction she understood but couldn't fully explain. The city at 5 in the morning was close to empty. Delivery trucks, a few early commuters, the occasional cab. The streets were wet from rain that had stopped while she'd been inside the hospital, and she hadn't noticed until now. Her home address. On a man who'd slipped through a service corridor while military operators were 3 rooms away. She ran through the geometry of it. Someone had known enough about the operation at Redwood Regional to position a backup inside the building with a physician's badge and an escape route. That level of planning didn't happen in 40 minutes. It had been prepared in advance, which meant the compromise of Veld's cover hadn't been recent, or the people who'd compromised it had been moving pieces into position before the hospital was even selected as the endpoint. And they had her name. Not Voss's name, not Rourke's name. Hers. She wasn't sure yet what that meant, but it meant something, and she needed to be in a room with people who had more information than she did before she could work out what. The federal building had an underground parking entrance that required a card she didn't have, So she parked on the street and was met at the front entrance by a man who checked her ID without speaking and walked her through 2 badge access doors to an elevator that went down rather than up. The basement floor was awake in a way that suggested it hadn't been asleep. 8 people at workstations, wall screens showing maps and data feeds, the organized hum of a situation room in active operation. Merritt was standing at the central table, and she was shorter than her voice had suggested, 50s, cropped silver hair, with the particular posture of someone who had stopped trying to look authoritative because they no longer needed to. "Sit down," Merritt said, not unkindly, in the tone of someone who noticed other people's physical state. "You've been on your feet for how long?" "Started shift at 3 p.m. yesterday." "Sit down," she said again. Claire sat. Someone put coffee in front of her. She didn't touch it. "The man from the service corridor," she said. "Who is he?" Merritt turned one of the screens toward her. A photograph. Surveillance capture, low angle, parking structure. The man was heavy-set, late 40s, moving with the deliberate speed of someone who knew cameras were present and had accepted that trade-off. "We're running facial recognition now. His prints aren't in the federal system, which tells us something. The documents he was carrying, the physician's ID was forged, but well forged. Expensive work." Merritt sat down across from her. "What concerns us more than who he is right now is what he was carrying in addition to your file." She slid a photograph across the table. Claire looked at it. A small device, rectangular, matte gray, roughly the size of a thick credit card, with a single port on one side. "We don't know yet what's on it. Our tech team is working on access now, but based on the casing and the port type, it's consistent with secure partition drives used to transport encrypted operational data." Merritt held her gaze. "The kind used to move intelligence product, or to move targeting packages." "Targeting packages," Claire repeated. "Lists, locations, schedules." Merritt's voice was even. "The kind of information you'd need if you were planning to move against multiple targets rather than one." The coffee in front of her was steaming. She picked it up and drank some because her body needed it, and because the alternative was sitting with the weight of what she'd just heard, and she wasn't ready to do that yet. "Why do they have my file?" "That's what we'd like to understand. The most straightforward explanation is that you became a liability the moment you walked back into that room. Someone in the building communicated your identity and your interference to whoever was running the operation from outside." Merritt folded her hands on the table. "But the file was complete, not assembled in the last 3 hours. Photo, home address, vehicle registration, employment history going back to nursing school. That takes longer than 3 hours." "Yes, it does." The room hummed around them. Someone at a workstation said something in a low voice, and 2 others turned to look at a screen. Claire watched the minor ripple of attention and waited. "You're suggesting I was already in the file before tonight," she said. "We're not suggesting anything yet. We're working with what we have." "But you're not dismissing it." Merritt was quiet for a beat. "No, we're not dismissing it." Claire set the coffee down. She thought about 4 years at Redwood Regional, the cases she'd flagged, the physicians she'd pushed back against, the charts she'd questioned. She thought about Voss and his particular brand of dismissal, the way he'd looked at her every time she'd raised a concern that fell outside the expected range of what a floor nurse was supposed to raise. She thought about 18 months. Sloan had said the hospital had been a staging location for at least 18 months. "Voss," she said, "his financial records are being pulled now. We'll have a clearer picture in a few hours." Merritt leaned back slightly. "What I can tell you is that Harlan Voss has made 3 international wire transfers in the last 14 months, to accounts we're still tracing. He's also had 17 meetings in the last 6 months with a man named Dorian Sark. Private security contractor, multiple flags in our system, currently operating out of a shell company registered in Delaware." "Is Sark the man from the corridor?" "We don't know yet." Across the room, someone said "Director," with enough sharpness that everyone in the space turned. Merritt was already standing. The screen on the far wall had changed. Live feed. A parking structure somewhere. The timestamp in the corner showing 5:04 a.m. The man from the service corridor. Moving between parked cars. Unhurried. Already knowing there were cameras because it had stopped mattering. "He's still in the city," someone said. "He wants us to see him," Claire said. Merritt looked at her. "He's not moving fast enough to be running. He's already been ID'd. He knows it, and he's still moving at that pace." She watched the screen. "He's drawing attention toward himself. away from something else. The room was very quiet. "Get eyes on Redwood Regional," Merritt said, and her voice had dropped to the register of someone whose instinct had just been confirmed by someone else's words. Now, what happened next took 11 minutes, and Claire only experienced parts of it. She was in the room when the call came in from the two agents who'd remained at the hospital. There was a problem in the secure custody arrangement. Not a breach, not a weapon, something subtler and therefore worse. One of the federal transport vehicles that had been staged in the hospital's rear service bay had been moved, internally, by someone with hospital access who had used a staff credentials card swiped at 4:52 a.m. to open the service bay doors. The credentials card belonged to a nurse who had been off shift since 7 p.m. the previous evening. The nurse had been in the staff break room for most of the night. She had not swiped her own card. Claire felt the sequence click into place with the specific, unpleasant clarity of a clinical pattern resolving. "There's someone else inside," she said. "Someone they left behind, not the man in the parking structure. He's the distraction. There's a second person still in the building." Merritt was already on the radio. What followed was the part Claire only experienced secondhand, in real time, via the audio feed they patched into the situation room. The confirmation that the transport vehicle had been moved to block the primary egress from the hospital's loading dock. The discovery that the hospital's internal comms had been partially disrupted, isolating two of the four agents on site. The subsequent room-by-room sweep that found a man in hospital maintenance coveralls in the sub-basement, which was where the hospital's server room was located. She heard the arrest. Brief. The man didn't resist in any way that registered as struggle. He'd already done what he'd come to do. "What's in the server room?" she asked. The pause before the answer told her most of what she needed to know. "The EHR system," one of the agents said over the audio, "and the security camera archives." "He was erasing the record," she said, "trying to. Our forensics team was already pulling copies off-site as part of the evidence protocol. He got about 40% before we found him." The agent's voice had the particular flatness of controlled frustration. "We have the rest." 60% of the documentation was intact. That included the camera feeds from the Bay 2 corridor for the hours surrounding Veld's intake. That included the EHR entries. That included her documentation, her flagged concern about the IV presentation, the timestamp of Mercer's dismissive chart entry. The 40% he deleted included the security feed from the corridor directly outside the service corridor bathroom, the one that would have shown his face. Claire drove back to Redwood Regional at 6:15 a.m. because Merritt asked her to and because she didn't have a reason to say no. The sun was beginning to matter to the sky over Portland, the kind of gray to pale transition that happened so gradually you noticed it only by comparison. The hospital looked the same from the outside. Inside, it had been reorganized in the particular way that federal evidence collection reorganized spaces. Not messy, just subtly occupied. Yellow placards at intervals, agents in civilian clothes moving with purpose, through corridors that were also trying to function as a working emergency department, which was an uncomfortable coexistence. Rourke found her near the entrance. "He's conscious," he said. "Came around about an hour ago. Partial consciousness, not coherent conversation, but responsive. He tracked movement, answered yes-no with hand pressure." She exhaled. "Still critical. But we've got a transfer arranged to a military medical facility within the hour, better equipped for the ongoing chelation protocol." He looked at her the way he'd looked at her after the pralidoxime push, evaluation, recalibration. "You should know that," he asked. When he got coherent enough to signal anything intentional, the first thing he communicated was that he wanted to know who'd been treating him. "What did you tell him?" "That a nurse named Claire Donovan had pulled the secondary dose 12 minutes before we arrived, and had been in the room for the first 2 hours of treatment." He paused. He kept his hand pressed flat on the bed rail for about 30 seconds after I said that. It was the most volitional thing he'd done. She didn't say anything. There wasn't a response to that which wouldn't have sounded like either too much or not enough. Patrice appeared around the corner, saw Claire, and stopped. "You came back," Patrice said. "I was asked to come back." "You don't have active credentials." "I know." Patrice looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned and went down the corridor and came back 2 minutes later with a paper form, a manually issued temporary access authorization, the kind the hospital used when the badge system was down. She filled it in, signed it, and handed it to Claire. This is good for 4 hours, she said. Official administrative oversight of patient care documentation. That's the category I'm listing. Patrice, don't make it a thing. Just take it. Claire took it. Sloan was in the administrative conference room with 2 federal agents and a woman Claire hadn't seen before, who turned out to be from the U.S. Attorney's Office. The room had the particular tension of a space where the people in it knew more than any individual person present and were still assembling the complete picture. Sloan looked at her when she came in and said, "We found the transport vehicle." "Where?" "2 blocks from here. Moved to clear the loading dock access, not to take anything. Whoever moved it wanted to create a window." He sat forward. "We think the server room incursion was secondary. The primary target was the medical bag. The rigid case. The 3 syringes." "Was it taken?" she asked. "No, our evidence team had already transferred it to a secure transport, but whoever sent the man in the maintenance coveralls didn't know that. They were trying to recover the compound." She thought about that, about what it meant that there were people willing to expose themselves in a federal investigation to send a person into a building already occupied by law enforcement to try to get back 3 syringes of a military-grade nerve agent. "The compound on the drive," she said. "The device the man from the corridor was carrying. Did your tech team get into it?" Sloan glanced at the woman from the U.S. Attorney's Office. "We have partial access," the woman said. She was mid-40s, meticulous, the kind of person whose thoroughness was visible in the way she organized the papers in front of her. "What we've recovered so far is a list of 11 names, cross-referenced with locations and what appear to be procedural notes." "Targeting package," Claire said. The woman looked at her. "You're familiar with the term?" "Merritt used it earlier." "Yes." The woman lined up a page. Captain Veld's name appears 3rd on the list. 7 of the remaining 10 are active military or federal personnel. The other 3 are civilians. She looked at Claire. "One of the civilian entries is yours." The room didn't go silent because it was already quiet, but something in the air quality changed. Claire looked at the page the woman slid toward her. Her own name in a font she didn't recognize, followed by her address, her vehicle, her shift schedule at Redwood Regional, and a single notation in a column labeled Status. The notation said Witness Obstruction. She had been on a list as a potential problem before she'd ever pressed a button on a dead man's wrist device. "How long has this list existed?" she asked. Based on the file metadata, this version was compiled 11 days ago, but there are version markers suggesting earlier iterations going back several months. She'd been on someone's operational list for several months while she'd been working triage shifts and flagging chart discrepancies and arguing with attending physicians about IV presentations. She thought about Voss, about the way he'd looked at her tonight, not with the standard irritation of a director managing a difficult nurse, with something more specific, more prepared. He'd known her name was on that list. "I want to talk to Voss," she said. "That's not," the agent started. "I know it's not standard. I'm not asking for an interrogation. I'm asking for 5 minutes in a room." She looked at Sloan. "He knows something about how my name got on that list. He's been working with these people for months, maybe longer. He's going to be focused on his own situation right now, which means he's calculating. If there's something he might trade, we have federal interviewers for that." "You have federal interviewers who he's been anticipating for 6 months because he knew this operation existed. He hasn't anticipated me." She held Sloan's gaze. "He dismissed me 4 hours ago. He thinks I'm a floor nurse who got lucky. That's still how he sees me, regardless of what's happened tonight. That's an opening." Sloan was quiet for long enough that it stopped being reflexive consideration and became actual deliberation. 10 minutes, he said, with an agent present. "You don't ask about operational specifics. You don't make representations about charges or deals. You're there to answer questions about your own termination, and anything else that comes up is incidental." "Understood." Awesome. Voss had been moved to one of the small consultation offices off the main administrative corridor, a room with 2 chairs, a small table, and a window that looked onto an interior courtyard. He was still in the same jacket from earlier. The rumple hadn't resolved. He looked in the fluorescent light of a room he didn't control, like a man who had spent several hours understanding precisely how narrow his options had become. He looked at Claire when she came in, and his expression cycled through 3 things fast enough that she caught all of them. Surprise, recalculation, something that might have been the leading edge of contempt, but didn't quite establish itself the way it usually would. "You're not supposed to be in this building," he said. "Temporary administrative access." She sat down across from him. The agent stood near the door, which they both understood. "I'm not here to discuss your situation." "Then what are you here for?" "My name was on a targeting list, compiled months ago. I want to know how it got there." He looked at the table. A small tell. Not guilt, not surprise, just the involuntary look away of a man who had already decided what he wasn't going to say. "I don't know what list you're referring to." "You knew who he was," she said. "The patient, Veld. You knew when he came in." A pause. "You didn't look surprised when those two men arrived," she continued. "You were already in communication with someone before you came down to the ER, which means you weren't managing a situation. You were executing a plan that had already been made. And that plan included my name on a list as a potential complication." Voss's jaw moved slightly. Not speech. Calculation. "The financial transfers," she said. "The meetings with Sark. The compound they've already traced through your facility's pharmaceutical records going back 14 months. They have all of it." She kept her voice even. "What they don't have yet is the person above Sark, the person who started this. That's the thing that has negotiating weight, and you know it, and you're sitting here trying to decide whether you know enough to make it matter." His eyes came up, just for a second. You don't work homicide," he said. "You're a nurse." "Yes, and you thought that was a reason to dismiss me." She leaned forward slightly. "How's that working out?" The silence that followed was not comfortable for either of them, but it was instructive. She watched him. He was 58 seconds from saying something, or she'd misjudged him entirely. A name that isn't in any of the financial records, not in any communications you'll find. A person who doesn't appear in this operation anywhere on paper. He said it to the table, not to her. "That's what I have." "Then I'd suggest you start talking to someone with the authority to make that matter," Claire said, "because that window is closing faster than you think." She stood up. The agent at the door moved slightly, the small adjustment of someone preparing to conclude. Voss looked up at her. His face had an expression she couldn't categorize, not remorse, not exactly, but something that had the shape of a man recognizing he was out of moves that were also dignified. "I underestimated you," he said. "Everybody does," she said. "Doesn't make it smart." She walked to the door. "Oh." The transfer of Captain Veld happened at 7:40 a.m. A medical transport vehicle, military marked, with Rourke and 2 other personnel on board. Claire stood in the bay when they moved the gurney out. She wasn't supposed to be there specifically, but no one told her to leave. Veld's eyes were partially open when they rolled him past. His skin still had the gray quality of someone whose body was doing serious repair work, but his pupils were equal. She noticed that before anything else. Equal, reactive. His eyes moved when they passed her. Not tracking, not purposeful, but they moved, and she was the only person standing still in that space. The gurney rolled through the bay doors and into the vehicle, and the doors closed, and that was that. Rourke came back through a minute later. He stopped beside her. "You'll hear from his command," he said, "when he's able." "Okay." "Claire." He said her name the way you said someone's name when you wanted them to receive what followed without deflection. "What you did tonight, pulling that line, staying in that room, the toxicology. There are people going home because of the chain you started. I need you to know that." She stood there in the loading bay with the morning air coming in cold around the edges of the vehicle bay door. Her badge was deactivated. Her termination was on paper. Somewhere in the city, a man with her home address had not yet been found. And Voss, in a consultation room upstairs, had just handed over something he'd called a name that didn't appear anywhere. "I hear you," she said. She meant it. She just also knew it wasn't over. Behind her, her phone rang again. Merritt's number this time, not unknown. She answered it on the second ring. "We got into the drive," Merritt said. There was something in her voice that Claire had not heard before. Not alarm, something else. Something measured and carefully contained. "All 11 entries on the targeting list are active. 7 have been acted on in the last 72 hours. 4 are still pending." A pause. "One of the pending entries has a timestamp notation, a scheduled execution window." "When?" Merritt told her. Claire looked at the clock on the loading bay wall. The window opened in 47 minutes. "Who's the target?" Claire asked. "Entry 11, Merritt said. "Listed as civilian, no affiliation. The notation reads, Final Accountability Closure. We cross-referenced the name with Voss's internal communications. A pause that lasted long enough to mean something. It's you, Nurse Donovan. You're entry 11. She stood in the loading bay and heard the transport vehicle's engine fade into the distance and felt the cold air come in and thought, with the particular clarity that arrives when a situation removes all ambient noise, that she should have understood this earlier. The complete personnel file. The months-old entry. The man in the parking structure who hadn't been running. He hadn't been drawing attention toward himself. He'd been confirming her location. The window opens in 47 minutes, she said. 46 now. We're moving assets, but you need to be inside a federal building, right now. Don't go to your car. My car is on the street. If they've had eyes on the hospital since last night. Don't go to your car, Merritt said again, harder. I'm sending a vehicle to the hospital's main entrance. 4 minutes. You stay inside until it arrives. She was already moving toward the interior door. The man from the parking structure. Still no ID? We have a name now. Dorian Sark. The same contractor Voss was meeting with. A beat. He's the one who compiled the list. Sark. The name Voss had let her bring out of the consultation room. Voss had handed it over because he'd already calculated that Sark was the piece he could trade, and because trading Sark meant the name above Sark, the one not in any records, stayed protected a little longer. She pushed through the interior door into the hospital corridor and let it close behind her. Voss gave me Sark's name 10 minutes ago, she said. He called it a name that doesn't appear in the financial records or communications. He was offering it as leverage. We know. The agent in the room reported it. Our people are already moving on Sark's last known locations. Merritt's voice had the quality of someone managing 3 conversations simultaneously and not losing any of them. What Voss didn't tell you is that Sark doesn't operate alone. There's a logistics coordinator who's been embedded in this city for 2 years running the domestic side of the compound distribution. We've been calling her Operator 9. Her, Claire said. Yes. She walked faster. The hospital corridor was starting to register the morning shift. People arriving, the energy changing, the overnight stillness giving way to the ordinary noise of a building reopening itself. No one looked at her twice. She was a woman in a jacket moving with purpose, which described half the people in the building. How does Operator 9 connect to the entry on my file? We think she's the one who flagged you, months ago. Someone inside the operation identified you as a pattern risk. Someone who asks too many questions, who pushes back against authority, who doesn't accept the accepted version of things. Merritt paused briefly. Essentially, someone who might do exactly what you did last night. Claire thought about that. About being cataloged as a risk because of the shape of who she was, rather than anything specific she'd done. She'd been on a list because she was the kind of person who notices things and says so. The months-old file entry predated Veld's arrival at Redwood Regional entirely. She turned the corner toward the main entrance. Through the glass doors, she could see the front parking area and the street beyond it, her car 3 rows back, the ordinary morning traffic moving past. 4 minutes, she said. 3.5. Don't exit the building. She stood back from the glass doors, far enough that she wasn't silhouetted, and waited. The vehicle that arrived was a dark SUV with 2 agents in the front, civilian clothes, no markings. She was inside and moving within 90 seconds of it stopping. They drove back to the federal building by a route that didn't repeat any road she'd taken before, which told her the driver had been briefed on more than just the pickup. The city was fully awake now, 7:50 a.m., morning commuters, the particular noise of a city that didn't know anything unusual had happened overnight, because most cities didn't know most things. Merritt was at the central table when Claire arrived. Next to her was a man she hadn't seen before, 50s, military-bearing but civilian clothes, the kind of face that gave away nothing about what it was thinking. He was introduced as Special Agent Corvin Bale, Federal Task Force Lead. Sark has been located, Bale said without preamble. He's in a vehicle on the Burnside Bridge, stationary, surrounded as of 6 minutes ago. He's not running, Claire said. No. He's waiting for confirmation that Entry 11 is resolved. Bale looked at her steadily. Yes. Which is why we're keeping your location off any communication channel that isn't fully encrypted. As far as anyone in Sark's network knows right now, his assets window is still open. She sat down. Her body understood that she'd been awake for approximately 19 hours before she consciously registered it, a deep physical heaviness settling into her lower back and behind her eyes that she could manage but not eliminate. "The compound on the drive," she said. "The other 7 entries that were already acted on. What happened to them?" Bale and Merritt exchanged a look that lasted about a second. 4 are confirmed dead, Bale said, ruled as natural causes or accidents over the past 72 hours. 3 are in medical facilities with presentations consistent with GX7 exposure. 2 of those 3 may not survive. He kept his voice even. Captain Veld was 3rd on the list. The sequence matters. The earlier entries were lower visibility targets, building toward higher value ones. Veld was the first active-duty special operations target, testing the compound's effectiveness before moving to higher value targets. That's our assessment. She absorbed it. 4 people dead, 3 in hospitals. A nerve agent tested progressively on human beings to calibrate dosing for subsequent targets. And the person above Sark, she said, Operator 9, the logistics coordinator. We're running down every lead from the drive. Bale moved a printout across the table. We recovered 60% of the data from the server room incursion. Your talks text documentation was in that 60, along with the security feeds from the East Corridor, the pharmaceutical diversion records going back 14 months, and Voss's internal communications with Sark's shell company. He paused. What we're still missing is the 40% the maintenance man deleted. Our forensics team is working on recovery, but we have to assume that 40% was targeted. He didn't delete randomly. He deleted the camera feed from outside the service corridor bathroom, she said, his face. And 3 months of email correspondence from Voss's private account, and the access logs for the hospital's pharmaceutical storage going back to when this operation began. The room was quiet except for the ambient sound of the workstations. Claire looked at the printout in front of her. Columns of data, timestamps, access events, a list of pharmaceutical items cross-referenced with patient records. GX7 precursor compounds hidden inside legitimate bulk medication orders. The hospital's pharmacy used as a mixing and storage facility. 14 months. Voss had been running this for at least 14 months. She thought about every patient who'd come through Redwood Regional in the last 14 months. Every medication administered. Every unexplained presentation she might have seen and attributed to something else. How many people came through that hospital without knowing what they were walking into? She asked. We don't have a complete answer yet, Merritt said. It's one of the questions we're working. The honesty of the answer was worse than a more definite one would have been. Sark's arrest happened at 8:17 a.m. Claire wasn't there. She was in the situation room watching a live feed from an agent on the bridge, the image slightly grainy from compression, the audio cutting in and out. Sark's vehicle, a gray sedan, unremarkable, was boxed by 3 federal vehicles. He came out with his hands already raised, which was the tell. Not a man surprised, not a man making decisions under pressure. A man who had prepared for this outcome. He was 51 years old, according to the file Bale slid in front of her while the arrest was still happening on screen. Former military, then private contracting, then a progression through increasingly opaque security firms that were visible on paper only as brief flickers before the ownership structures dissolved and reconstituted. 15 years of operating in the space between legal and not, with enough care that nothing had stuck until now. He looked, on the grainy feed, like a man who was calculating even as agents were securing his hands. Not panicking, not relieved, calculating. He's going to lawyer up and stay quiet, Claire said. Probably, Bale agreed, which is why what Voss gives us matters, and what's on that drive matters. We don't need Sark to talk. He knows that. Which is why he's not running and he's not fighting. He's already decided that his value is in what he knows, not in what we can prove. She watched the feed. He'll try to trade Operator 9. Bale was quiet for a moment. That would be consistent. The question is whether you get to her before he decides she's worth more than his own outcome. We're working on that. She looked at the printout, at the column of names, at her own name at the bottom. I want to be useful, she said. Not sitting here watching feeds. What do you actually need from me? Merritt and Bale exchanged a look again, the look of 2 people whose silent communication had been developing over enough shared operations that it had become its own language. The 40% that was deleted, Merritt said, Our forensics team is attempting recovery, but deleted files aren't always completely gone. Residual data, cache fragments, backup remnants. Your documentation from last night, your personal phone notes, your nursing observations, fills in some of what's missing from the official record. But you also worked in that hospital for 4 years. She leaned forward. You know things about how that building functions that aren't in any file we have. Workflows, personnel patterns, which staff members worked which areas, which pharmaceutical orders were unusual enough to be noticed, even if no one said anything. Claire looked at the table for a moment. 4 years of shifts. 4 years of watching things work and watching things not work, and flagging the gaps that physicians walked past without seeing because they were trained to see a different layer of the same picture. "Get me paper," she said. She wrote for 2 hours. Not documentation this time, reconstruction. Everything she could remember about pharmaceutical handling at Redwood Regional over the past year. The orders that had come through overnight rather than during standard hours. The storage areas that had been periodically restricted with explanations that made partial sense and so had never been fully questioned. The staff rotations that had shifted in the last 8 months in ways that, viewed individually, looked like ordinary scheduling, but viewed as a pattern described access management. Specific people kept away from specific areas during specific windows. She wrote the names of orderlies who'd been transferred to night shift without apparent reason. She wrote the name of the pharmacy supervisor who'd gone on an unexpected leave of absence 5 months ago and returned with a different energy, not changed, just tighter, like someone who'd been shown something and had decided silence was the correct response. She wrote it all without editorializing, because this wasn't her interpretation. It was her observation, and there was a difference, and she was careful about the difference. Bale's team took each page as she finished it and cross-referenced it against the 60% of records they had. 3 times someone came to ask her a follow-up question. Once, she heard someone say, "That matches," across the room in the tone of someone connecting something that had been disconnected. At 10:30, a forensic tech came in and said they'd recovered 14% of the deleted email archive. At 10:43, Merritt came to the table and sat down and said, "Operator 9 has a name." Claire put her pen down. Lydia Brann. She's been in Portland for 26 months. She runs a logistics consulting firm that has contracts with 3 regional hospital systems. Merritt's voice was precise, each word placed with care. Including Redwood Regional, where she's been a supply chain consultant for the past 18 months. Claire thought about the supply chain, about the pharmaceutical orders that had come through at unusual hours, about the pharmacy supervisor who'd returned from leave with something tight behind his eyes. She was on site, Claire said, regularly. 12 documented visits in 18 months for legitimate contract purposes, and an unknown number of additional visits that were still tracing through access log reconstruction. Merritt paused. She was in the building 3 days ago, the day before Veld's cover was compromised. She knew he was coming. That's our working theory. Veld's cover broke through a supply chain contact. Someone in the network he'd been embedded in recognized a pattern inconsistency. That information would have moved through Brand's logistics network to Sark, and from Sark to Voss. Merritt's hands were flat on the table. The entire operation to receive Veld at Redwood Regional and eliminate him there was assembled in 72 hours. Brand coordinated it. Where is she now? That's the problem. Merritt held her gaze. She left Portland on a 6:40 a.m. flight this morning. We have her boarding the plane. We do not have her on arrival at her listed destination. Claire thought about the window on the drive. The 46-minute countdown she'd been given that morning. The man on the bridge who'd been waiting for confirmation. She left before Sark was arrested, she said, by approximately 90 minutes. She knew. She knew before Sark was on the bridge that it was over. She was already moving. Claire stared at the table. The man in the parking structure, the confirmation she was waiting for. He failed. She already knew he'd failed before she got on the plane. That's consistent with the timeline. So she's gone. She's not at her destination. Whether she's gone, Merritt stopped, which was its own answer. The room continued its hum around them. People working, phones going, the ordinary machinery of an investigation that had not resolved cleanly despite everything. Claire picked her pen back up. There were still things she hadn't written down. She wrote them. The press of what was happening outside her immediate radius reached her in pieces throughout the morning. At 11:15, she learned that Voss had formally waived his right to remain silent and begun a proffer session with federal prosecutors, a controlled, attorney-guided disclosure of information in exchange for consideration that wasn't yet a deal but was moving toward the shape of one. He had, in the room this morning, given a name that opened a door, and now he was walking through it with the particular grim efficiency of a man who understood that the only remaining question was how many years he subtracted from his own sentence by being useful. At 11:50, she learned that the pharmacy supervisor, whose name she'd included in her written reconstruction, had been contacted and had immediately asked for counsel, which was not guilt, but was not nothing. At 12:30, federal agents executed search warrants at 3 locations connected to Brand's logistics firm, including a storage facility on the industrial east side of the city that had been listed in company records as a regional equipment depot. What they found in that facility was documented in a message Bale brought to her table personally, rather than relaying through the room. He set a photograph in front of her. She looked at it. Shelving units, crates, temperature-controlled storage containers with the same port-style casing she'd seen on the device the man from the corridor had been carrying, and beside them, stacked in rows that suggested inventory rather than disposal, pharmaceutical containers she recognized from the hospital's bulk storage format. "How much?" she asked. "Enough," Bale said. "More than enough to establish scale. This wasn't a small operation contained to one hospital. Redwood Regional was a processing and distribution hub. The compound went out from there through the supply chain network Brand managed." She looked at the photograph for another moment, at the clinical, organized rows of containers. "The other hospital systems with her contracts," she said. "Were they also being used?" "We're executing simultaneous warrants at 2 additional facilities right now." He picked up the photograph. "You should know that Voss's proffer included detail about the pharmaceutical diversion scheme that we didn't have before." He confirmed Brand managed the full supply chain. He also confirmed that the targeting list on the drive wasn't the only list. There were 2 earlier iterations that were fully executed. She heard that. She held it. "How many names total?" Bale was quiet for a moment. "Across all iterations, across the full operational timeline, we're looking at 31 entries." She put her pen down and looked at her hands. 31 people on a list compiled by people using a hospital, a place people went specifically because they were vulnerable, as a mechanism. Some of them might have walked into Redwood Regional as patients. Some might have been targeted elsewhere, and the hospital used only for this final chapter of the operation. She didn't know yet. There were many things she didn't know yet, but she'd stopped 28. Not alone, not neatly. But she'd pulled a line, she'd pressed a button, she'd walked into a lab at midnight with a syringe, and that chain had started everything else. 28 of 31 entries had not been completed because of what had started in Trauma Bay 2 at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. The remaining 3 were Veld, who was alive, and 2 others who were in military medical facilities with a chance. She picked her pen back up. At 1:15 p.m., something happened that she hadn't anticipated. She was still at the table. She'd been brought food at some point and had eaten approximately half of it when Sloan came into the room. He'd been at the hospital all morning, overseeing the federal evidence operation. He was carrying a tablet, and he set it on the table in front of her without preamble. On the screen was a video message, military-grade encryption header, already played once by the look of the interface. She looked at Sloan. "From the medical facility," he said. "About 20 minutes ago." She pressed play. The image was shaky, clearly a handheld device close to a hospital bed. Captain Marcus Veld was not sitting up. He was still prone, clearly not well, oxygen monitor clipped to his finger, an IV line visible at the edge of the frame. His face was gray and his voice was slow, each word requiring a decision, but his eyes were clear and equal and tracking the camera. "Nurse Donovan," he said. He stopped. Restarted. "I'm told I owe you approximately 12 minutes, give or take." A pause. "I don't have a better way to say thank you for someone's life than to say it directly. So, thank you." Another pause, longer, and she could see the effort it cost him. "I'm going to be fine. Eventually." A sound that was approximating a dry laugh, but didn't quite get there. "That's what they keep telling me." The image ended. She looked at the tablet for a moment after it went dark. Sloan picked it up without saying anything about it, which was the right call. Bran, she said. Still no confirmed location. We have a network of contacts being tracked. Passport flagged. Financial accounts frozen as of this morning. He sat down across from her. She planned for this. There's a contingency structure in place. She's been moving through it. But you'll find her. We'll find her. He said it without inflection, not reassurance, just statement. This kind of network leaves traces even when it tries not to. The storage facility gave us 3 additional contact points. Voss's proffer is giving us financial trails. Sark, once his counsel finishes their intake, he'll talk, because Sark is the kind of operator who always believes he can negotiate better than the evidence against him. He looked at her. This is going to take time, but it's going to close. She nodded. There's something else, he said. He was choosing his words with more care than usual, and she noticed. The Naval Special Warfare Command has been briefed on Captain Veld's recovery. His CO contacted us this morning. Sloane held her gaze. They want to formally acknowledge your actions. There will be a process for that. Documentation, review, the appropriate channels. It's not something that happens in a day. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I know. He paused. Your termination is on paper. That's going to become a different kind of paperwork very quickly, but I want you to know we understand that right now on paper, you don't have a job. I'm aware. The hospital's interim administration, Voss's position is being covered by the assistant director while we sort out the formal suspension, has been notified that your termination was filed under circumstances that are now part of a federal investigation. The HR flag on your credentials is legally complicated at this point. She thought about her dead badge, her name on a termination form. Voss filed that paperwork while federal agents were in his building, she said. While he was standing against a wall, he signed a termination notice for a nurse who had just stopped someone from being killed inside his hospital. She said it without heat, the way you state a sequence of events when the sequence is its own argument. That document is the best possible evidence of exactly who he is. Sloane's expression did something at the edges that might have been as close as he came to amusement in a professional setting. Yes, our attorneys are of a similar view. She looked at the table, at her handwritten pages, 14 of them now, full of 4 years' worth of observations that she'd been carrying around in her head without knowing they were evidence. She thought about Patrice, who'd handed her a paper form at 6 in the morning because there was no digital option available, and Patrice was the kind of person who found the available option. She thought about Milo Ferris, who'd run a spectro-panel on an unidentified compound at midnight without flinching. She thought about Rourke, who'd said 3 seconds is nothing, 3 seconds happens to everyone, which was the most useful thing anyone had said to her in the last 12 hours, because it was precisely true. I need to sleep, she said. Yes, Sloane agreed. You do. When do you need me back? Tomorrow morning is early enough. We'll have more of Voss's proffer by then, and the search warrant results from the 2nd and 3rd facilities. He stood. We have the car ready to take you home. 2 agents will remain outside your residence overnight. She gathered her pages, stood up. Her back registered the objection of someone who had been sitting in institutional chairs for too long, which was almost comforting in its ordinariness. She was almost to the door when Bale came through it from the hallway with the specific purpose-driven movement of someone who'd been looking for a room rather than a person, and then saw her and stopped. We got into the deleted 40%, he said. He looked at Merritt, then at Claire. The email archive, 3 months of correspondence between Voss and Brand's operational account. He held up the tablet in his hand. And something else. He set the tablet on the nearest table and pulled up a document. She came back across the room. The document was a list, not the targeting list, a different format, a different purpose. It was a personnel roster. Redwood Regional Medical Center, marked confidential, dated 8 months earlier, highlighted in a column of names, with a notation beside it in what appeared to be Brand's operational shorthand. RRINT, long term, confirm ongoing. She looked at the notation, at the name it was attached to. It wasn't Voss's name. It wasn't Sark's name. It wasn't anyone she'd expected. It was Patrice Reyes, the charge nurse who had told her to walk away, who had handed her a paper form at 6 in the morning, who had been in the building all night. Claire stood very still with the tablet in her hand, and the room was very quiet, and the weight of the last 16 hours pressed against everything at once, and she looked at Bale and said, "Where is she right now?" Bale was already on his radio. Bale's radio came back with an answer in under 90 seconds, which was both fast and insufficient because the answer was that Patrice Reyes had left the hospital at 12:40 p.m., 22 minutes ago, after completing her charge nurse handoff to the incoming day supervisor. She had signed out on the paper log, which was the only log still functioning after the credential system disruption, and she had taken the east exit toward the parking structure, the same parking structure where Sark had been photographed. Claire stood at the table and ran the timeline backward with the particular speed of a mind that had been doing clinical pattern recognition for 4 years. Patrice had been in the building all night. She'd been in the staff cluster at the nurses' station when the military arrived. She'd approached Claire in the corridor after Voss's termination notice. She'd handed Claire a paper access form at 6 in the morning. The paper form. Manually issued, not logged in the digital system, which meant Patrice had known the digital system was compromised, either because she'd compromised it herself or because she'd been told it was going to be. Her vehicle registration, Claire said. Someone at a workstation was already pulling it. Gray Honda, 4 years old, Oregon plates. Flag the plates, Bale said, already moving. And get eyes on every exit from that parking structure going back 30 minutes. Merritt looked at Claire. Did she know you were here? Claire thought about it. She knew I left the hospital this morning with federal personnel. She didn't know this location. But she knew you were alive. Yes. Then she wasn't waiting for confirmation. She was waiting for something else. Merritt turned toward the workstations. Pull her phone records as of now, all towers in the last 3 hours, and get someone on Brand's secondary contact list. If Brand is moving through a contingency structure, she has communication nodes. Reyes might be one of them. The room shifted gears in the way it had several times already tonight, the organized acceleration of people who had done this before and knew what to do with new information. Claire stood in the middle of it and felt the specific exhaustion of a situation that kept adding rooms. She'd written Patrice's name down. In the reconstruction, she'd spent 2 hours producing. She'd written about the pharmacy supervisor who'd returned from leave with something tight behind his eyes. And she'd written about the staff rotations that had moved people away from specific areas. And she'd written about the paper forms and the analog workarounds that had proliferated in the last several months at Redwood Regional in ways that hadn't made obvious sense at the time. Patrice had managed most of those staffing rotations. That was a charge nurse's job, schedules, assignments, who went where. It was invisible authority, the kind no one questioned because no one thought to. 8 months ago. The notation on the personnel roster said 8 months, which meant Patrice had been operating inside the network for 8 months, while Claire had worked alongside her, trusted her read on situations, taken her advice. She thought about walk away at the door of Trauma Bay 2. How easily she'd almost done it. They found the gray Honda at 2:14 p.m., not at the parking structure exit, 11 blocks east, in a surface lot behind a commercial block, engine off, keys on the seat, Patrice's hospital badge on the dashboard. Abandoned with the deliberate legibility of a message. I was here, I'm not here anymore, and I left these things because I won't need them. The phone was gone. Her personal items were gone. The car itself was a shed skin. She had a go bag, Sloan said, when the field agent called it in, prepared ahead of time. She knew this was coming, Claire said. Not last night specifically, but she knew eventually it would end and she had an exit ready. That's consistent with how Brand's network operated. Contingency at every level. Patrice was in that building for 8 months. She knew every protocol, every access point, every workaround. Claire looked at the surface lot photograph on the tablet, at the badge on the dashboard. She managed who had access to what. She could have protected that operation from internal discovery for years by controlling which staff worked which areas. We're pulling her financial records now, and we flagged her ID with Border Control and TSA. She won't use her own ID? No. But Brand's network required financial infrastructure, and financial infrastructure leaves traces. We'll find her. Sloan said it the same way he'd said we'll find Brand, not reassurance, just the flat professional confidence of someone describing a process that worked, eventually, if imperfectly. It takes longer than one afternoon, but it closes. Claire handed the tablet back. She thought about Patrice handing her that paper form. Had that been tactical, keeping Claire visible, trackable, inside the building? Or had it been a residual reflex of something? Patrice used to be before she'd made whatever calculation had led her to Brand's network 8 months ago? She didn't know. She wasn't sure she'd ever know exactly, and she'd had to make her peace with that category of question before, in other situations, where the clean answer didn't arrive. People were not always comprehensible. That was a clinical fact as much as a human one. Well, she went home at 3 p.m. The federal vehicle dropped her at her building, and two agents in a parked car across the street stayed where they were when she went up. Her apartment was exactly as she'd left it 19 hours ago. Coffee cup in the drying rack, her work shoes by the door, the window in the kitchen that didn't close all the way, letting in a thin line of cold air that she'd meant to fix for 2 months. She stood in the middle of her living room for a moment with her jacket still on. Then she took the jacket off, drank a full glass of water standing at the sink, set her phone to allow only calls from Merritt and Sloane's numbers, and lay down on her bed without changing her clothes. She was asleep in approximately 4 minutes. She slept for 9 hours. Not cleanly. There were stretches where she was aware of the sound of the building around her, of traffic, of her own breathing. But the sleep was real, and it was deep enough to change something in the texture of her thinking when she came back out of it. She lay on her back in the dark for a few minutes before checking her phone. The window in the kitchen was letting in the night air. The city was doing what cities do at midnight, which is its own specific set of sounds. 3 missed calls from her sister, who lived in Tucson and had apparently seen something on the news. She'd deal with that tomorrow. 1 text from Sloane. Status update in the morning. Nothing urgent overnight. Get some sleep. 1 from Merritt. Voss proffer complete. Substantial. We'll brief you at 0900. She put the phone down and looked at the ceiling. She thought about the shape of the last 24 hours. Not chronologically. She'd been running that sequence in her head throughout the day, and she knew it well enough that it was starting to lose meaning. She thought about it differently, the way she thought about complicated patients after a shift, not what happened step by step, but what it meant. She'd walked into a trauma bay to argue about an IV presentation. That was the center of it. Everything that followed had been downstream of that. The syringe, the button on the wrist device, the phone call, the lab, the statement, the written reconstruction, the tablet with Patrice's name highlighted on a roster. All of it had started with a woman standing at a glass door watching something that didn't add up and deciding that it didn't matter who told her to step aside. She'd almost stepped aside. She'd said that to Rourke and she meant it. 3 seconds was real, that period where the weight of authority and the promise of simplicity and the threat in Voss's voice had nearly been enough. People talked about moments like that as though the right choice was always obvious from the inside, but it wasn't. The right choice looked exactly like the wrong choice in the same 3 seconds, which was why so many people made the other one. She'd made her choice for reasons she couldn't fully articulate even now. Partly clinical, the bag with the wrong typeface labels, the syringe she couldn't account for. Partly something more instinctive and harder to name, the thing that happened when a nurse's understanding of a patient situation outrun the authority structure around her, and she had to decide in real time which one she trusted more. She hadn't known about Veld. She hadn't known about the compound or the list or Sark or Bran or any of it. She'd known a man was dying in a way that didn't make sense, and someone was trying to stop her from helping him, and those 2 facts together had been enough. She got up, fixed the kitchen window, and went back to sleep. The morning briefing at 9 a.m. was in the same situation room, but the atmosphere had changed, less acute, more systematic. The shift from emergency to investigation that happened when the immediate crisis resolved and the longer work of building a prosecutable case began. Merritt ran through Voss's proffer. It was, as she'd said, substantial. Over 14 hours of recorded statement across 3 sessions, Harlan Voss had provided the operational history of his involvement with Sark's network going back 22 months, not 1822. He'd been recruited through a professional contact, a board member at a hospital in Seattle who had since disappeared into a different federal investigation and about whom Voss claimed limited knowledge. He'd agreed to allow Redwood Regional's pharmaceutical supply chain to be used as a processing and distribution point in exchange for payments totaling nearly $400,000 across the full period. He had known about the compound. He had known what it was and what it was being used for. He had not, by his account, known the full scope of the targeting list. He'd understood that people were being eliminated and had chosen to understand it only in the abstract, which was not a legal defense, and he understood that now. He had known Patrice Reyes was an internal contact for the network. She had been recruited approximately 8 months ago through Brand's logistics network, initially to manage staff access and pharmaceutical tracking, and later as a broader operational buffer. someone who could identify potential threats from inside the hospital's staff before they became external ones. He had, 8 months ago, flagged Claire's name to Patrice as a potential monitoring priority. Not because Claire had done anything specific, because Patrice had described her, accurately, as someone who didn't accept presented versions of things, who pushed back against authority in ways that were professionally couched but persistent, who noticed discrepancies in clinical presentations that other staff moved past. That description had moved up through the network to Bran, who had opened a file. "So Voss put me on the list by telling Patrice I was a problem," Claire said when Merritt finished. "Indirectly, yes. She absorbed that. The particular irony of being flagged as a risk because of professional qualities that had turned out to be exactly what stopped the operation. His allocution includes a full account of the night in question," Merritt continued. "His movements, his communications with Sark before and during the event, his authorization of the fake physician's access, his termination of your employment, all on the record." She paused. "He signed the proffer agreement this morning. In exchange for full cooperation, prosecutors are recommending a reduced sentence recommendation, but reduced from a very high baseline. He's still looking at significant federal time." "How significant?" "The lead prosecutor's estimate, off the record, is 15 to 20 years given his age and the scope of the charges. Federal facilities, no early release possibility on the primary charges." Merritt's voice was even. "That's not a deal. That's cooperation credit on top of what the evidence already establishes." 15 to 20 years. Harlan Voss, who had sat behind his director's desk for 6 years and treated the nursing staff as scenery, who had stood against a wall in his rumpled jacket calculating his angles. 15 to 20 years was a long time to have nothing left to manage. She didn't feel satisfaction. She'd expected to, and she didn't. What she felt was something quieter and less clean, the particular feeling of a consequence arriving that was correct and proportionate and still couldn't undo the 4 people who were dead, or the 3 who were recovering in military medical facilities, or the 31 entries on a list that had represented a human being's life reduced to a column notation. Justice was the right word for what was happening. But justice was not the same thing as repair. The search warrant results from the 2nd and 3rd hospital facilities arrived in full during the briefing. Both locations had been used by Bran's logistics network, though at smaller scale than Redwood Regional. At the 2nd facility, in Salem, federal agents found a secondary compound storage cache that had not yet been distributed, enough GX7 derivative to represent a significant additional threat had it reached its intended recipients. The 3rd facility, outside Eugene, appeared to have been a transit point rather than a storage location, primarily used to move materials between Bran's supply chain nodes. 3 hospital systems. 14 months of documented operation. A distribution network that had been running invisibly through the spaces between legitimate pharmaceutical supply chains, protected by the institutional trust that surrounded healthcare facilities. The assumption that hospitals were environments of care rather than infrastructure for something else. That assumption was why it had worked as long as it had. And it was, Claire thought, the most important thing about the whole operation. Not the compound itself, not the money, not the military targets, the mechanism. The use of a hospital as a weapons delivery system precisely because hospitals were where people went when they were most vulnerable and most trusting, and that vulnerability was supposed to be protected. Voss had violated that. Patrice had enabled it, Bran had designed it, and a nurse who asked too many questions had been the first thing in 22 months to make the mechanism fail. Bran was found on the 4th day. Not through the financial traces, though those were closing in, through a logistics error, the kind of small operational failure that Merritt described as almost banal, the way things sometimes ended. Bran had arranged a vehicle through a contact in a Pacific Northwest smuggling network, who turned out to be under separate federal surveillance on an unrelated import case. The contact's phone, already being monitored, contained a message thread that, when federal investigators identified it, placed Bran at a location 60 miles southeast of Portland, in a rural property registered to a shell company whose ownership chain circled back to one of Sark's dissolved security firms. She was arrested on the morning of the 4th day without incident. Claire heard about it from Sloan over the phone. She was at her kitchen table with the window finally fixed and a cup of coffee, and the particular quiet of a morning where she had nowhere mandatory to be, which had been her daily reality since the termination notice, and which she hadn't yet resolved into either relief or discomfort. "Bran in custody," Sloan said. "Sark's counsel has been notified. The plea negotiation process is going to accelerate significantly." "She'll fight it," Claire said. "Her attorneys will. She'll calculate. That's what she does." He paused. "The evidence is extensive enough that calculation leads to the same place regardless of how long it takes. The storage facility, the financial infrastructure, Voss's proffer, the drive data, the communication records we recovered from Sark's devices. She can fight or she can cooperate. Either way." "And Patrice?" "Still working on it. She's in the wind, but her financial access has been cut completely. That limits options. We have contact surveillance on 12 individuals connected to Bran's secondary network. It's a matter of time." She looked at the fixed kitchen window. "Sloan, yeah. How many of the 31 entries were people who never knew they were on a list?" A pause. "Most of them." "That's the part that stays with me," she said. "They went about their days. They went to work, went home, made plans, and their names were in a column." "That's the part that stays with me too," he said, and didn't offer anything more because there wasn't anything more to offer. The formal reinstatement process took 11 days from the date of termination. It wasn't smooth. The hospital's HR system required the termination to be formally vacated rather than simply overridden, which required legal documentation from the federal investigation, certifying that the termination had been filed under circumstances material to a federal case, which required a specific form that the federal attorney's office had to generate, which required a supervisor's signature, which required that supervisor to be available, which he was not on a Wednesday because of a prior commitment. That was the actual texture of it. Forms and availability, and an HR specialist who was professional and helpful and required to follow the process regardless of the circumstances that had led to the process being necessary. On the 11th day, Claire received an email from the interim director of Redwood Regional Medical Center, a woman named Dr. Fiona Ashby, brought in from an administrative role in the hospital's parent health system while the investigation proceeded, confirming that her termination had been vacated, her personnel record cleared of the relevant entries, and her clinical credentials reinstated at full standing. The email also included a formal letter of apology from the hospital's board of directors, which Ashby had clearly written herself rather than assigning to legal, because it said specific things rather than careful things. It acknowledged what Voss had done, what the hospital's systems had failed to catch, and what Claire had done in the middle of a situation that the hospital's own safety protocols should have prevented from reaching her in the first place. She read it twice. It was a good letter. She was aware it was a letter and not a person, but it was a good letter from a person trying to say a real thing, and that mattered. Patrice was formally terminated in absentia on the same day, pending criminal charges that were sealed until the investigation reached its next phase. 3 weeks after the night in Trauma Bay 2, on a Tuesday afternoon, Claire went back to work. She drove the same route she'd always driven, parked in the same structure, came through the main entrance wearing her badge, her actual badge, active, credential verified, registered in the system. The east corridor looked the same, the nurse's station looked the same, the supply alcove at the end of the corridor looked the same, which gave her a moment she hadn't anticipated, the particular internal adjustment of walking past a place where something significant had happened and finding it simply itself. The day shift staff knew. Of course they knew. 17 days had passed and the story had moved through the hospital, the way things moved through hospitals, which was fast and with varying accuracy. Some of them looked at her with the particular expression of people who don't know how to calibrate what they're looking at. Some of them were normal. One of the newer night shift nurses, a man named Trevor, who had been working at Redwood for about 8 months, and who Claire knew mostly as someone who asked good questions during handoffs, stopped her in the corridor and said simply, "Glad you're back," and moved on before it could become a thing. The attending physician on duty that first day back was Dr. Mercer, the same one who had spent 40 seconds with Veld on intake and said alcohol and exposure and moved on. He looked at her when she came onto the floor with an expression that she could only describe as a man who had spent 3 weeks understanding the full dimensions of a mistake and who had arrived at an uncomfortable clarity. He didn't say anything in the first hour. Midway through the second hour, he came to the nurse's station where she was charting and stood for a moment. "I should have listened to your clinical read," he said. She looked up. On the intake. I should have listened. She held his gaze for a moment. He was not comfortable saying it, which was part of what made it real rather than managed. Yes, she said, you should have. And then, because she was a person and not a symbol, I've missed things too. Not that night, but other nights. Everyone has. She paused. What matters is what you do the next time someone flags something that doesn't add up. He nodded once, went back to his patients. She went back to hers. Sark's plea agreement was finalized in the 5th week. Federal counts of conspiracy to commit murder, illegal manufacture and distribution of a controlled biological agent, obstruction of justice, and 2 additional charges related to the financial infrastructure of the operation. The sentencing recommendation was 32 years. His counsel had negotiated a cooperation provision that reduced a potential life sentence, but 32 years at 51 years old had its own arithmetic. Bran entered a not guilty plea that her attorneys indicated would almost certainly change as the trial date approached, and the evidentiary weight became fully visible. The federal prosecutor assigned to her case was the same meticulous woman Claire had met in Sloane's conference room, the one who organized her papers with visible precision. Merritt, briefing Claire by phone, described the evidence package against Bran as one of the most comprehensive she'd seen in 20 years of federal work. Voss was sentenced on a Thursday morning in week 6. Claire was not in the courtroom. She was at Redwood Regional in the middle of a 12-hour shift when Sloane sent a text. Sentencing complete. 18 years, federal. No possibility of early release on primary charges. All professional licenses revoked. She read the text between patients, sent back a single acknowledgement, put her phone in her scrub pocket, and continued her shift. That was the thing no one told you about the conclusion of something like this. It didn't announce itself with weight. It arrived the way most significant things arrived, between other things, in the middle of the ordinary, requiring you to hold it briefly and then set it down because the work was still there. 18 years, all licenses revoked. A man who had believed absolutely in the permanence of his own authority, who had signed a termination notice for a floor nurse while federal agents stood in his building, who had spent 22 months treating a hospital as his private instrument. 18 years in a federal facility was where that belief had led. She put her phone away and went to check on the patient in Bay 3, who had presented 40 minutes ago with atypical chest pain that the triage notes had logged as probable musculoskeletal, but whose EKG trace had a subtle finding she wanted to look at again. But the coin arrived on a Friday, 6 weeks and 4 days after the night in question. A small package in the mail, naval return address, no personal note. Inside was a challenge coin, brass heavier than it looked, engraved with naval special warfare insignia on one face and a unit designation on the other. And a folded card. Not a formal letter. A card, written by hand, in the specific handwriting of someone who did not write by hand very often. Nurse Donovan. I was told you'd want this explained. Military people give challenge coins to people who did something we can't find a better way to say thank you for. This is that. I'm back on my feet, 86% of the way, which is better than anyone told me to expect at this point. Rourke says that has a lot to do with what happened in those first 2 hours. I believe him. Emveld, Captain. She turned the coin over in her hand. The brass was warm from the packaging. She set it on her kitchen table and looked at it for a while. She thought about a man she'd never spoken to, whose eyes had been partially open, whose hand had moved when she'd told him what she was about to do, whose chest had been rising at the wrong interval when she'd left that room, and who was now, by his own account, 86% of the way back to himself. She thought about 12 minutes, about what 12 minutes actually contained, the full stack of small choices that had been made in sequence, none of them certain, none of them clean, each one requiring the next one before the outcome could be known. She wasn't the kind of person who collected things, but she put the coin on her nightstand and it stayed there. Captain Veld came in person in the 8th week. She'd known he was coming, Sloane had told her, and she'd had several days to think about what that conversation would be like, none of which turned out to be accurate. He arrived at the hospital on a Tuesday afternoon, out of uniform, moving with the slight deliberateness of someone whose body was still filing reports about recent damage, but no longer letting it make decisions. He was taller than she'd expected, which was irrational, given that she'd only ever seen him horizontal. They sat in one of the family consultation rooms because it was the most private space available on short notice, and it was quiet there, and the hospital's ordinary motion continued on the other side of the closed door. He didn't deliver a speech. She'd half expected one and was relieved when he didn't. He sat across from her and said, "I've read the full account of that night, multiple times." "Okay. There's a thing I want to say, and I'm not going to be able to say it well, so I'm just going to say it." He held her gaze in the direct way of someone who had decided on honesty over performance. "You didn't know who I was? You didn't know what the operation was. You walked back into that room for a patient you didn't know, against direct orders from the person who controlled your employment, with no backup and no certainty about what you were walking into." She didn't say anything. It was accurate. "That's not ordinary," he said. "I've worked with a lot of people in high-stakes situations. The willingness to act correctly when the correct action is costly and uncertain, that's not a given. Most people find a reason not to." "I almost found a reason not to," she said. "But you didn't." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "I wanted to come in person because I didn't want you to have only paper from me. Cards and coins are fine, but they're—" He paused, the pause of someone editing in real time. "You deserve to have someone sit across from you and say that what you did mattered, and have you be able to see that they mean it." She looked at him, at the slight tension in his jaw that was probably residual nerve damage working itself out, at the clear, equal pupils she'd noticed the morning they'd rolled him past her in the loading bay. "How's the 86%? She asked. Something in his face shifted towards something that was not quite a smile but occupied the same neighborhood. 91 now. It's slow." "Circulation recovery is slow," she said. "You'll get there." "That's what Rourke keeps telling me." "Rourke's right." They sat in the quiet for a moment. The family consultation room had a small window that looked onto the hospital's interior courtyard. A few benches, a tree that was doing its best given the Pacific Northwest light, a patch of ordinary sky. "There's going to be a formal recognition," Veld said, "Naval Special Warfare Command, in conjunction with the Federal Task Force. Merritt's office is coordinating. It's not something that happens fast. There's a process," he paused. "But it's happening." Sloan mentioned, "I want you to know it's not ceremonial. The documentation attached to it is real. It goes into the permanent record of the operation." He looked at her steadily. "The operation that you essentially stopped. By yourself. In a 12-hour shift." She absorbed that version of events. It was accurate in its way and incomplete in its way, the way all summaries of complicated things were. She thought about Milo Ferris running a spectro panel at midnight without flinching, about Rourke adjusting atropine doses in the first 2 hours, about Sloan saying find the nurse through a stairwell door. "I had help," she said. "You started it," he said. She didn't argue. It was true, Chick. Patrice Reyes was arrested on a Wednesday morning in the 10th week at a border crossing in Montana, attempting to cross into Canada under a passport in a different name. The network contact who had arranged the document had been compromised 6 days earlier through Brand's financial infrastructure investigation, which meant the document had been flagged before Patrice ever tried to use it. She hadn't known. That was the way things ended for people who operated inside networks that were collapsing. The structure failed from multiple points simultaneously, and by the time you discovered one failure, several others had already closed your options. She was extradited to federal custody in Oregon and charged with conspiracy, obstruction, and accessory charges related to the full scope of the operation. The preliminary hearing was brief and covered only jurisdiction and detention. Her attorney entered a not guilty plea. The evidence package being assembled included 8 months of internal hospital documentation, her communications with Brand's operational accounts, and the access log reconstruction that showed which areas of the hospital had been systematically managed around the operation's logistics. Claire was not in that courtroom either. She heard about it the same way she'd heard about most of the procedural developments. A brief text from Sloan in the middle of a shift between patients. She stood at the nurse's station and read the text and felt the things she'd felt about Voss's sentencing and Sark's plea and Brand's arrest. Not satisfaction, exactly, but the specific weight of consequence arriving where it belonged, which was different from satisfaction and more durable. She put the phone away. She went to check on the patient in Bay 1 who had come in 20 minutes ago with her sister, scared and in pain, needing someone to make the situation legible and manageable and not alone. That was the job. It had always been the job. The formal recognition ceremony happened on a Thursday morning in the 12th week. in a federal building meeting room with about 40 people in attendance. Military personnel, federal investigators, hospital administrators, 2 people from the U.S. Attorney's Office, including the meticulous woman with the organized papers. Dr. Fiona Ashby was there, which Claire appreciated. Rourke was there, Sloan, Merritt, Milo Ferris, who appeared to have purchased a new jacket for the occasion, and who gave Claire a look when she came in that said, "I have been processing this for 3 months, and I still don't fully have it." She understood that look. Veld was there, out of uniform, moving at what looked to her clinical eye like about 93%. The formal part was brief. A citation read by Merritt, describing the events of the night in specific procedural terms. The timeline, the interventions, the downstream impact. A framed document. A handshake from the task force commander, a man she'd never met who had nonetheless spent the last 12 weeks aware of her name. And then it was less formal, the way these things became less formal when the ceremonial portion completed and people were just people in a room with bad coffee and the shared experience of having been involved in something significant. Rourke found her near the window. "How's the floor?" he asked. "Same as always, busier since the staffing changes." She looked at the coffee in her hand. "We lost 4 nurses in the investigation fallout. Patrice, obviously, and 3 others who were interviewed and cleared but who transferred anyway because the environment felt different." She paused. "It does feel different. I'm not sure if that's good or bad yet." "Probably both," he said. "Probably both," she agreed. Milo Ferris materialized at her elbow. "I've been asked by approximately 30 people what it was like to run the talks panel that night," he said. "I keep saying I just ran the panel, Claire's the one who brought it to me, and they keep looking at me like I'm being modest." "You're not being modest." "I'm genuinely not. I ran a panel. You figured out there needed to be a panel." He looked at her with the expression of someone who had thought about something for a long time. "I did want to say, it mattered that you trusted me to run it. A lot of people would have gone around the lab. You came straight to me." She hadn't thought about it that way. She'd come to him because he was good at his job and available, and she'd needed information. The trust had been clinical rather than personal, but standing in a room 12 weeks later, she could see how the distinction might matter less than the action. "You ran it without asking me why," she said. "That mattered too." He nodded once, satisfied, and drifted toward the coffee. She drove home from the ceremony in the early afternoon, through the city she'd lived in for 9 years, past the hospital she'd worked in for 4, along the route she'd driven hundreds of times in the dark at the end of night shifts with the radio on, and her mind halfway into the next day already. She thought about what Veld had said in the consultation room, that most people find a reason not to act when the correct action is costly and uncertain. She'd been turning that over since he'd said it, not because she disagreed, but because she wanted to be honest with herself about what it described. She was not a person without fear. She had been afraid that night. She had been afraid when Voss told her she was finished, afraid when the man in the trauma bay had moved around the bed toward her in that particular way, afraid in the stairwell with 2 syringes in her pocket and her hands not fully steady. The fear had been real and present and had not disqualified her from the next decision. That was the thing she wanted to be accurate about. Not that she'd been brave in the sense of fearless, she hadn't been, but that fear turned out not to be the deciding factor. The deciding factor had been looking at a patient who needed something and having the technical knowledge and the stubborn refusal to accept the presented version of things, and those 2 elements together had been stronger than the fear. She didn't know if that was a quality she'd always had or something she'd built over 4 years of trauma nursing, of being in rooms where the situation was bad and the options were limited and the only available action was the next correct small thing. Maybe there wasn't a difference. She parked in her usual spot, went up. The kitchen window was fixed. The coffee cup was in the drying rack. The challenge coin was on the nightstand. She looked at her apartment, at the ordinary collection of things that made up a life that had continued through the last 12 weeks, while also being permanently changed by them. Both of those things were true simultaneously, which was the nature of before and after. She made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, looked at her phone and called her sister back, which she'd been meaning to do and had been finding reasons to delay because the conversation was going to require explaining things she wasn't sure how to explain yet. Her sister answered on the second ring. "Claire, finally. I've been watching the news for 3 weeks." "I know, I'm sorry." "Are you okay?" She thought about the 12 minutes, about the equal pupils in the loading bay, About Voss's termination notice sitting on a counter at the nurse's station while she finished her documentation on paper. About a coin that was heavier than it looked. "Yeah," she said, "I'm okay." She meant it. Not in the clean, resolved way. There were still things that woke her up at 3 in the morning and required a glass of water and a few minutes at the fixed kitchen window. There was still Patrice's face when she handed over that paper form, which she hadn't been able to fully stop seeing. There were still 31 names in a column, and 4 of them would remain there regardless of what happened in any courtroom. But she was okay in the way that mattered most. She had looked at something wrong and said so. She had stayed in her room when she was told to leave. She had walked back down a stairwell toward whatever was at the bottom, because the alternative was a man she didn't know dying in a way that she could prevent. She was still a nurse at a hospital in Portland, Oregon. She was still the person who noticed the things that other people walked past. She was still, in the specific and unremarkable and essential way, exactly who she'd been when she'd stood outside Trauma Bay 2 at 11:47 on a Tuesday night and pressed her hand against the glass. Nobody had given her that. She'd arrived with it, and now everyone knew it.